Chapter 2. One constant truth of life amongst the spears: the more you grew, the more you had to carry. Lysoni's hands were raw from the dry air and the constant hoisting up of her ill-fitting pack. She hated that pack, an endless gray of the dormant plains. At least now, as spring arrived, there were sporadic bursts of flowers in the dead grasses and lingering snow, and seeing them made her burden a little lighter. As she walked, Lysoni kept her head down. That let her think, the earth hypnotizing as it passed beneath her feet. Blessed monotony, the swaying of the stalk so much white noise. And with a bit of distance from the others, she was able to tune out the voices and sounds of her tribe. Ever since that day on the river, and her first encounter with the sacred herbs, she began slowly questioning everything. Runine visited her often, teaching Lysoni more and more about the plants inhabiting her world. Although her mother disapproved, it occupied Lysoni, and she finally seemed to be finding a niche in the clan. Plus, with Lysoni being watched over most of the day, her mother had more time to seek a new mate. She had to replace Lysoni's father, an esteemed hunter who had died from a saber-tooth ambush. Lysoni had gotten little by way of details of his death growing up, but other small ones had bullied her with stories of the blubbering and wailing as he was dragged away by his neck. She would never know what really happened, Lysoni thought bitterly, pushing the pack up once again on her sore shoulders. For many winters, Runine had spun outlandish tales of things that made Lysoni laugh with nervousness, wonder with suspicion, and in most cases, disregard. She knew that Runine's unique weirdness kept her at a distance from the clan. Wilds always live on the edge of everything, but that made her wonder how much of a person's actions could be controlled, constrained, or suppressed. Or was it all just up to the fickle gods and elemental spirits? With that thought, Lysoni shifted the plug of herbs in her mouth, squeezing and sucking it between her cheek and molars. Each pull of the juice gave her a little more energy, dissolving the boundaries between her, the grass, the crickets, and the blue sky. Suddenly, she detected Runine's approach without looking and smiled. Her powers of perception were growing. Trotting up to Lysoni, Runine had a massive smile on her face. "We almost there. Special time," Runine said, smacking her hands together and rubbing them in celebration and warmth. Lysoni smirked at Runine's exuberance, shifting her pack again. Hey, here, give," Runine insisted, scooping the air with her arm. Lysoni had learned it was much easier to allow her to help sometimes than try to argue. She swung the leather and fur pack off her weary shoulders and handed it to Runine, who hoisted the bag in one smooth motion, rubbing her neck and trapezus. Lysoni looked past the caravan of her tribe and focused on their destination. The enormous hill dwarfed the silhouette of tents, huts, and seasonal, makeshift structures, littering its gentle curve. As she watched smoke spiraling from the encampments, Lysoni smiled, imagining all the new and wondrous things she might see over the coming days. For as long as she could remember, Lysoni's people had come to the gathering on the hill to trade supplies and feast, and later she learned, mate with the Long-Legged tribe. Ever since the spear's first encounter with the Longlegs, each season brought new rumors and gossip. They were half-gods. They were stretched by magical forces when they slept. They had been cursed long ago and now had to hunt forever with those gangly limbs. But even before they claimed religious dominion over the central portion of the hill, the Longlegs had heeded its eerie siren song, promising victory. Their tradition had always been to thank the gods with sacrifice, but conditions must be right. The large stones at the top of the mound caused the wind to hum and whistle, sounding like partial words and songs of spirits. And the medicine keepers of the Longlegs had interpreted those murmurs and songs as "build here." But when the spears eventually found these newcomers on their sacred hill, Many battles unfolded on that patch of stones and shrubs. Over the seasons, the constant tension and conflict had taken too many warriors and hunters, making the foraging activities of the women and children dangerous. And without wild crafting of berries, nuts, seeds, and tubers, neither side would have any reserves to survive a meager hunting season or harsh winter. And so an agreement was reached, the first between the two peoples. They would share the region, the mound, but the spears would never be allowed between the sacred rocks again. The Longlegs had already anointed them with holy symbols, pictures of animals and tales of creation. The Spears were okay with that, as they worshipped the elements, Mother Earth and her bounty, not barren rocks. With a tenuous agreement in place, feasting and trading commenced. Eventually, the Spears left along their migration routes again. But the following season, the Longleg encircled the stones with felled trees, lashed together and twice as tall as any spear. Only their medicine keepers went in and out of the makeshift fortress. From within, the sound of small rocks pounding and chipping huge rocks became just another constant background noise, like the wind in the grass. Since childhood, the wooden wall greeted Lawsone each year as she marched up the hill. She liked the constant chorus of holy men and women carving the ancient limestone slabs into who knows what. Sometimes, when no one was within earshot, she would make up funny songs to the clack, 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 and revel in not sharing them with the other kids. Eventually, when Lawsone had reached mating age, her mother had taught her about the myriad of ways she must avoid shaming their family. So many things might bring curses down upon her clan, or worse, the tribe. And above all else, she was not to offend the Longlegs, lest trade stop or their gods curse the Spears with deformed offspring. Supposedly, the impossibly heavy stones had somehow been raised up over the winter, standing even taller than the Longlegs. Lawsone huffed at the premise. The feat seeming fantastical from what she knew of big rocks, they liked laying down and staying put. Lawsone squinted at the hill, and sure enough, the weathered wooden fence was gone. In its place stood a tall structure covered with what looked like water buffalo or deer skins. Tired from speculating and marching, she cast her eyes down again, mad at her ignorance of so many things. As Runine grunted in her usual, overly dramatic exaggerations, Lawsone's mind kept rehashing an underlying feeling of being somehow less than the Longlegs. Why would gods need a house? Rubbish, she muttered, as a bead of sweat stung her eyes. She had no opinion about all the rumors. Still, Lawsone knew as much as anyone else in her tribe about the outsiders. The Longlegs had a faster, sharper, and more complex way of speaking, of singing even. This prompted the Spears to invent talking sticks, fashioned from hollow wood and bone, to supplement their own speech and replicate the foreign tongue. And the Longlegs had tamed wild osprey to fish for them, hawks to hunt for them, and the trickster, hooded crows to spy for them. Both people kept dogs, but the Longlegs had also made a pact with the wolves. They fed the beasts at the hill's perimeter, training them to come at night. The wolves kept larger predators at bay until the sun returned. How would they charm these beasts, Lawsone often wondered. Could she learn this skill as well? Heavy, Runine protested, going from a frown to a grin as she pretended to barely be able to walk, sending Lawsone into a laughing jag. But, Lawsone thought, what was wrong with all this perfectly acceptable wide-open space? Or their last camp, where they had only spent a day until there was a sign. And between the chiefs, the warriors, and the medicine keepers, the signs always pointed to move, hurry, danger. It was stupid and infuriating to Lasoni, because she did see signs. However, none of them indicated endlessly walking the same trodden trails for the rest of her life. After a lull, Runine broke the silence. "This year, she said, hitting her speaking stick 3 times at the highest octave as she grunted sexually. Up ahead, the tail end of the caravan turned and laughed but kept moving. "No!" Lasoni hissed, blushing. Mating was the last thing on her mind, but her furs told another story, suddenly too hot. It was none of Runine's business, really. Why didn't she just get her own man and leave Lasoni out of it? However, with another pull from the herbs in her cheek, Lasoni got her answer and felt its truth. Runine would die alone, with no mate or children, probably ending up in the belly of one of those stinking wolves. The mere thought of Runine, her best friend, becoming a meal for the enchanted servants of the Longlegs made Lasoni ill, so she tried to think of something else. "How you so much not fun?" Runine said, looking almost insulted by Lasoni's prudish reaction. "You say no, no, but I will. Oh, I will, ha ha," Runine said, the pack seemingly weightless suddenly as she puffed out her chest and hooted. "What, you?" Lasoni said with raised eyebrows and nervous laugh. Long legs, so delicious." Lasoni was hoping that meant good to look at and not... "I don't want our men. They are like this grass," Runine said, running her hand through the seeded stalks. "Rough, boring, scratchy, and hollow, you know?" Once again, Lasoni didn't know, but she did understand. The Longlegs were majestic to her as well. Most had hair as black as charcoal and skin the warm tan color of their deer-hide tunics. When they spoke, it was like music to her, and they were adorned with paints and jewelry that they kept tight control over, only sharing with the spear's chieftains. And the long strides they took! They only slowed for her people out of courtesy, as they could already be far away in a few steps. Perhaps that was why they had won the initial battles with the spears, running literal circles around them. Despite the conflicts, it had always been the healers on both sides who had made the peace. They had shared the plants of the gods and bound over hedonistic revelries. After that formal ceasefire, the cultural exchanges turned to more practical matters: food, clothing, spices, medicinal herbs, and flakestone tools were exchanged. Eventually, even mates were cautiously swapped, the resulting offspring a curious, diverse hybrid. Thinking about the long-legged men stirred something inside Lasoni, creating a squirmy feeling in her gut like a tickle. She sucked in a deep breath of cold air to distract herself, looking over at Runine. "Spear boys don't like me," Lasoni said in a clipped tone, looking away shyly. "And the Longlegs, well, they never look at me, so how would I know?" No need to save strength then," Runine said, swinging the pack off her shoulders and flinging it over to Lasoni. "I done. See tonight, maybe?" Runine said with a wink and a chortle. "Fine," Lasoni said, the pack chafing on her burning shoulders. "Oh, little bird. You find pouch in your bag, yes?" Lasoni knowingly smiled, as Runine deftly dissolved into the sounds of the grass and buzzing prairie. The pouch would most likely be more herbs, perhaps a little extra to trade for exotic things from the Longlegs. Runine had trained Lasoni in the art of harvesting and preparing many of the medicinal and holy herbs, and over time she had also shown Lasoni how to commune with their personalities, properties, and powers. Even other spear medicine keepers deferred to Runine a time or two, in private of course. The recognition of her peers had been a source of secret pride for Runine, and perhaps a means of leverage someday if she needed a favor. Snorting away a buzzing insect, Lasoni squinted at the hill's peak as the huts grew more prominent with her approach. The spears had set up many tents and cooking fires, obscuring half of the stone circle's base. Her tribe camped like the forest, with enough space between tents for 4 or 5 to pass shoulder to shoulder. On the opposite side, completing the ring, the Longlegs built semi-permanent fences out of sticks and woven reeds, just high enough to keep in children and keep out opportunistic predators of every type. And their huts were almost touching, which seemed claustrophobic to Lasunie. But she figured it was by design to guard their many secrets or hide their women. As Lasunie caught up with the convoy, a gaggle of bored children ran up to her, acting scampish, begging for baubles, laughing, and trying to make off with anything not lashed to her person. She liked children, but not a flood like this. With a few weary shouts from Lasunie, they took off giggling, and she finally trudged into the spear camp. Her stomach ached as she passed soups bubbling and meat crisping over fires. Angry suddenly, she spat the used plug of herbs into one of the trash piles, wishing it had been food. Asking around, she found her mother's tent and called cautiously from outside in case she was with a man. "Yes, come, come," her mother said, holding open the leather flaps. Stumbling inside, the fatigue of the long march hit her all at once. Lasunie swung the pack off her pink shoulders, handing it to her mother. She practically collapsed onto their stuffed mattress, the sound of snapping grass escaping as it compressed. "Oh, Mama, so tired. Oosh, and your shoulder so painful," her mother said, pulling a skin of ointment out of the very pack Lasunie had been carrying. She carefully smeared the fat and herbs onto the abrasions with deft, leathery hands, making Lasunie wince and curse under her breath. I just need to," Lasunie began, her eyes closing involuntarily. Yes, daughter, you rest. There are many fine men here, many, many. Perhaps we both find one," her mother said in that elated tone she reserved for special gatherings. But before Lasunie could protest, she dissolved into a deep sleep.